Convenience foods, often demonized and vilified in the world of health, particularly gut health, but that's not the whole story. In today's episode of Kitchen Alchemy, I'll be talking about that connection and correlation to our changing gut health over the past 75 years. And I will be sharing a surprising connection, a personal connection to Dwight Schrute from The Office, while I make a healthy TV dinner. I asked a lot of people what their favorite TV dinner was growing up, kind of the classic TV dinner, and a lot of you answered Salisbury steak, which was also my favorite. So I'm going to be making a kind of a Salisbury steak variation while I make my healthy TV dinner. So let's get started on that as we dive more into our changing gut health. Ingredients of our hamburger steak is going to be pretty simple. So I've got 1 pound of ground turkey. You can use any ground meat you like. Ground beef is great too. I'm going to add 1 egg. I've got 1 teaspoon of salt and a 1/2 teaspoon of pepper. And this is 2 cloves of garlic, although they were pretty small cloves. So 1 to 2 cloves of garlic, depending on your taste and how big your cloves are. 2 tablespoons of freshly grated Parmesan. You need to use freshly grated because most of the cheese you buy in the store, there's some that don't. You could use that, but a lot of grated cheese, pre-grated cheese from the store has cellulose added, and you don't want that. It is not good if you have IBD. Cellulose also very much degrades the flavor of cheese. And then I'm putting in 1 teaspoon of yellow mustard. I'm just going to eyeball it here, so I'm not going to do an exact measurement. So I've got this pretty well mixed, so I'm going to form the patties. So hamburger steaks are supposed to be formed into oval patties. I guess that supposedly looks a little more like a steak. Just going to I'm going to do 4 patties and go from there. Got my patties made here. Tried to get them as even as I could. So I'm just going to add a little salt and pepper to the outsides. That'll give them a nice sear when I cook. Got them into the pan on medium heat. And we're just going to cook them for about 3 minutes per side. We're not cooking them through yet. We just need to get them the sear on the outside and a little brown, a little bit starting to cook. And then we're going to make our gravy. And I'm just going to salt and pepper this side while they cook here. So I'm going to make the gravy in this pan when these are done. And one note is if you use ground beef, you're going to get a lot more drippings and stuff like that. So I won't have very much from the turkey. They only had extra lean turkey at the store. So I put in 2 tablespoons of oil. I'd probably only do a tablespoon if you're using a higher fat ground meat, but this needed a little extra boost of fat. 3 minutes, side 1, flip. So you can see it's got a nice sear to it and it's nice and browned on the first side. Second 3 minutes are up. So I'm just going to move these to a plate while we make our gravy. For the gravy, I have 2 tablespoons of butter. I've got 1 cup of chopped onion. And I'm just going to let this cook for about 5 to 10 minutes until the onion is translucent. So I just cooked it right in the same pan. You could probably use a little less butter if you have a lot of grease left over from your meat, but I need a little more for mine, so this is what I'm going to do here. My onions are soft and browned, so I'm just going to add in another clove of garlic here and let that cook just for about 30 seconds to get it a little bit soft. And one note is you could make a mushroom gravy. A lot of hamburger steaks or Salisbury steaks have mushrooms. I just don't really like mushrooms. So you could cook mushrooms, just look up for how to make a mushroom gravy actually. I don't even know because I don't like mushrooms enough to have ever tried it. So I have 2 cups of chicken broth here. You can use whatever kind of broth you like. I'm going to put that in, but I'm going to save a little bit out to whisk with my lentil flour, which is what I'll be using to thicken this up a little bit. So I'm going to add in 1 tablespoon of lentil flour. I don't want this to get too thick. So if you don't have lentil flour, you could just thicken it with some extra onion, and you could blend it if you want it to get more of that thicker consistency. This is optional, but it is a little more gravy-like if you do have some lentil flour that you could use. Whisking it ahead of time will help it keep it from clumping when you stir it with the rest of the gravy. And so lentil flour, if you're on an SCD diet, you need to make sure you get one that has been soaked properly. So this brand does soak for the right amount of time before they make their lentil flour. So that is what I use. Adding in my little slurry of lentil flour and broth here. I'm just gonna mix this a little bit, and now we're gonna add our patties back to it. Okay, got my patties back in the pan, so I'm going to bring it up to a boil. Then I am going to let these simmer for 10 minutes per side. So this is boiling, so I'm just going to reduce the heat down a little bit. You just need to keep it slightly bubbling, but you don't need it to be boiling hard. In fact, you don't want it to unless you really need to reduce your liquid. The 1950s saw the rise in prepackaged convenience foods. There's a lot of reasons for this. Part of it is technology, of course. Part of it was a post-war boom. Well, more people were heading out to work, including more women, as started to enter the workforce during that time because they had been working during the war. We saw more people not staying in one place. So convenience foods were kind of important because people were not at home as much. So we saw TV dinners, we saw packaged foods that were quicker to prepare. We started seeing stuff like minute rice. Cereals became very popular, and those became more, which started as a health food, and cereals are very healthy. Cereal grains can be very healthy, part of a great, very healthy diet. But what we saw was marketing to children, which meant more sugar in our cereals and in a lot of foods. And of course, we saw the rise of fast food starting in the 50s, and that's where people are out of the house more and they're traveling, and they are trying to get stuff from work, and just all kinds of reasons for that. But what you might be surprised by is when these foods first started, especially like TV dinners and cake mixes and stuff like that, and even fast food, it was actually considered to be a sign of status because they're like, we don't have to cook our own food. We can have it done for us. We can have these conveniences. And unlike the people who didn't have as much means, they had to still cook the traditional food. So cooking was seen as something maybe that lower class people would have to do. And at times, these foods would be marketed as healthy options. And this goes back before the 50s even. But we would see marketing as this is the healthy choice to make. I especially love these fruit pies with a lot of fruit and also a lot of sugar. But we know over time that convenience foods and foods that were more and more processed started to become more and more of a standard part of our daily life. And so when we're talking about processed foods, most foods are processed in some way. Just cooking it is processing of food. But what I mean is ultra processed foods. And what that is, so processing food is steps that take it further and further away from its natural state. So ultra processed foods, the foods are the furthest away from foods in their natural state. And why that's important is that we start to see a rise in chronic illness over the same period of time. Does that mean that the food causes these illnesses? No, it does not mean that. We don't know. There's a lot of different thoughts and opinions about that. I'm not going to make a judgment call on that, but I'm going to say there is a correlation, and for some people, it could be a higher correlation or causation even than others. So it's not just the food itself, it's our own body, our own genetics, our own environment that might trigger our own DNA, whatever we have genetically, to respond to these things. And we don't really know a lot about that. That's why you see a lot of people with all kinds of different things going on. Some people can eat whatever and nothing ever happens. Some people respond very well to dietary change. Some people need more than others. And that's very hard to figure out. But if you've been somebody who is like, I am doing all this stuff. If you have IBD, I'm doing all these dietary changes and I'm not seeing the results I want. That is not your fault. That is like a message I try to get across all the time. That is not your fault. It could be the way your body is responding. It could be you just haven't found the right pathway yet. And that's an important thing to note. So there's all this rise in chronic illness. According to the CDC, over 75% of adults in the US have at least one chronic condition, while over 50% have multiple chronic conditions. The most common chronic conditions are obesity, hypertension, diabetes, asthma, kidney disease, and depression. But of course, there are many other chronic illnesses, including IBD. 30% of youth in America also have at least one chronic condition, and that's age 5 to 25. And then they share many of the same types of chronic conditions as adults. The US seems to have the burden of these chronic health conditions, although they are growing around the world, as I will be getting to in a few moments here. And that is something that researchers are really looking into and looking at the effects of these kinds of foods on inflammation in our bodies and how our bodies might respond and how different genetics, they're looking for genes that might trigger with these different kinds of things. And it's very difficult. It's very difficult to figure this stuff out. So that's why the process is so slow. I want to talk a little bit more about this correlation between the increase in prepackaged, more processed foods over the decades and the increase in IBD over the decades. So I moved up into my office so we could take a little bit of a closer look at that. Okay, so let's anchor this with one of the cleanest long view timelines we have, Cardiff, Wales. In IBD research, Cardiff shows up over and over because it has tracked Crohn's across decades, long enough to see it go from rare to common. So we're going to be talking about incidence. So incidence means new cases per year. It's not how many people have it. It's how many new people are diagnosed this year. It's usually reported per 100,000 people. I'm going to emphasize incidence because it helps us see when disease is spreading into a population versus just being better managed. In the 1930s, Crohn's incidence was about 0.18 new cases per 100,000 people per year. So that is not very many at all. By the late 1970s, it was about 4.8 per 100,000. That's not a small change. That's going from something that was very, very rare, something almost unheard of, to something clinicians were seeing very regularly. While the original Cardiff study went from 1934-37 to 1977, they did continue their research over decades, so it didn't stop in 1977. Cardiff has follow-up work that extends into later decades, showing that the rise continued into the early 1980s, and then later shifts towards high but more stable rates. So a steep climb across the mid to late 20th century, and then a leveling pattern as things became more industrialized and then they were fully exposed to modern environmental factors. That means like everybody in the population started to have like the same exposures. So it's not like people weren't getting it, it just the rate did not continue to climb. The incidence rate did not continue to climb with new diagnoses. So now we're talking about incidence and then new cases per year, but now we're looking at prevalence, which is how many people are living with IBD total. Even if the incidence levels off, like I was just saying, prevalence can keep climbing because people are living longer with the disease, and we call this compounding prevalence. So why do we see this plateau of incidence? And there's going to be a lot of different reasons for that. And the Crohn's disease early on was more prevalent in Western regions. So diet patterns, antibiotics, hygiene, urban living, so the pool of newly exposed people each year stops expanding. So once diagnostics and awareness mature, there are fewer missing cases left to uncover, which can make incidence look steadier over time. Bottom line is it's multifactorial and still something we still have to work on looking at. But while we have seen stabilization in a lot of the Western countries, which is Crohn's was primarily a Western disease, that has shifted. As more and more countries begin to industrialize and urbanize, there is more indoor life, there are more antibiotics, there's more stress, less sleep, and diets that shift from ingredients to products. And IBD starts showing up where it used to be very rare. It wasn't non-existent necessarily, but it was more rare. And of course, that's going to be with better medical care. There's going to be more diagnosis, but this even takes that into account, where they're seeing rises in countries that are industrializing, urbanizing, and where Western products and restaurants are moving in. So you just start to see that more and more as time goes on. This pattern starts to show up across Eastern Europe, the Middle East, Africa, Latin America, and it's moving at the same rare to rising fast rate that we saw between the 30s and the 70s in the Cardiff study. So that is what we need to look at. Convenience isn't evil, and sometimes it is survival, which I'll be getting to more of in a second here. But when convenience becomes the default, your body is going to react to that. So what is important about this? It's a look at like how we're seeing these same rates increase the same as we did between the 30s and the 70s and into the 80s, where incidence rates were increasing. We're starting to see that in other countries that are becoming more and more industrialized. So what is the common factor? Well, we don't know exactly. So that's why I'm looking at this. And that's why I'm looking at the impact of the increase in processed food. It's not like, oh, these foods are all bad, but for some of us that have triggers of ingredients that we don't really know, that could be a factor. It could just be a factor that we're just having more and more of it and our bodies can't sustain it. We don't really know, and everybody is different. So you can see people who don't have any problems. You can see people who have problems with much less. And we don't know, because there are so many factors. There's genetic component, and there is your environmental component, and there's there's the unknown component. And that's what makes this difficult, but that's why I wanted to look at this, to draw some parallels at the very least between an increase in ultra-processed foods and these rates of chronic illness, particularly where I'm focused on IBD, because it can help us figure out how to approach treatments. Even just knowing, like, if there's more genetic components, if there are certain environmental and dietary components that are going to help people, the more information we have, the better. There is another study that's going on now in the UK from King's College, where they're looking at emulsifiers and Crohn's disease, and what they found was certain emulsifiers, and there's a whole list, which I'll put a link to the study in the description. But there are stuff like cellulose and carrageenan, and a few of the other common ones that are in a lot of packaged foods. They found that people who either eliminated or decreased these, even just decreasing them, that they saw positive results in a significant percentage of the people who with IBD who tried this. So I think that's an important component, is just saying, we are starting to draw a little bit more conclusions between dietary response and IBD. And I think that is a very important thing to look at. And why it's also important to me is to have that balanced look, is because I know these foods helped a lot of people. Helped keep them from going hungry. It helped, shelf-stable foods have been an important part of our history and an important part of helping us get through a lot of things. And that is why I do like to take that balanced approach and not demonize anything, because I was one of those people. Food scarcity is a thing that's, an issue that we need to deal with. We need to get more fresh foods. People, to everybody, people need access to those foods, and so they can have a variety, because a variety is very important, not just for health, but for enjoyment. But I was one of those people growing up. We were on food assistance when I was very little, and so sometimes we did have to rely on more packaged foods, although we had access to variety. So I promise you, what's the connection with Dwight Schrute from The Office is that the actor who played him, Rainn Wilson, grew up in the same little suburb of Seattle that I did. In his book, The Bassoon King, he talks about some of the inspiration for Dwight being this beet farmer who also works in an office is living in this suburb.
Schrute Farms, guten Tag. How can I help you?
And because a lot of the people had like kind of farm stuff, even though we were just in a suburb, like, and we were one of them. We raised chickens in our backyard. So we always had some fresh eggs and sometimes some chicken. My mom would sometimes butcher a chicken for us to eat. But we always had the fresh eggs. And then my grandparents, who lived next door at the time, had a huge garden. And the people across the street from us had a goat. And the people down the street had a little hobby farm. And then there was like kind of a bigger farm that looked a little more like Dwight's, kind of nestled back in our neighborhood. So that's where that connection comes from. And I just wanted to point that out because of that, I did have access to a lot of fresh foods that other people may not have access to if they live in a more urban area. People don't, or even just in an area where people aren't raising chickens and growing huge gardens in their backyards. So that's my connection there. And that's also my point of understanding that sometimes we had to have those things. And that's why I am making a healthy TV dinner today, because I used some convenient foods that I got from the store. And that really helped me kind of get back to those roots, because I actually kind of enjoyed some of those foods sometimes when I was little. But I also recognized that we sometimes had trouble getting enough food. And I know a lot of people have that trouble. So I am not going to demonize these foods. I think we jump to nobody should be eating this, but sometimes we have to. So now that we've kind of learned a little bit about food and history of looking at through the decades of processed foods and IBD rates, let's go back down and try that TV dinner. I have my hamburger steak here with gravy, along with some riced cauliflower that I sauteed, some sauteed green beans, carrots, and cooked apple. All right, let's try out the hamburger steak here, because I've never made this exact recipe before. So we've got our patty with a little gravy on it. That is so good. It's so full of flavor with the garlic and just salt and pepper, but with the gravy and the right sear on the meat, it turned out great. Love it. Really, if you missed that Salisbury steak, this has a lot of the umami that has, and so this is a great dinner. And this tray I'm using is microwavable, but it is safe plastic that you can microwave and feel comfortable about. And yeah, love it. So tell me in the comments, are you going to make your own healthy TV dinner? What kind are you going to make? And what was your favorite? Thanks for watching, and please like this video if you enjoyed it and learned something, and I will see you in the next one.